I'm only still only new here, but thank you. And I want to speak a little tonight about the affordability of housing in Australia. And it's certainly something that I'm passionate about myself, having been a first home buyer in the post house price boom that we experienced at the beginning of the century. And I bought that house actually here in Canberra, and it was a difficult market to buy in. But I've also now moved to a regional town, to Yeppoon, just outside Rockhampton, and it certainly is a tale of two cities. The housing affordability issues aren't necessarily the same in regional towns and centres as they are in our major cities, and I think it's sometimes unremarked enough that one of the solutions perhaps to the issues that Australia has with affordable housing is to develop new cities and new opportunities where land supply is not as scarce and housing affordability therefore would be improved. So, for example, at the moment the median house price in Sydney is around $930,000, a remarkable figure. In Melbourne it's $688,000, and for all capital cities it's around the $660,000 mark. But when you go to regional Australia, you get prices that are around half that amount. And indeed, I'll just focus on some towns from Queensland, where I'm from. In Cairns, the median house price is $380,000. In Charters Towers, $207,000. In Townsville, $350,000. Bundaberg, $275,000. Gladstone, $356,000. Mackay, $370,000. Rockhampton, $294,000, and Toowoomba, $350,000. Very much affordable on today's average wages. So the question should be asked, why don't we spend more time, we're serious about housing affordability, more time considering developing our regions as a solution to this issue, rather than simply focusing on the solution or the answer in our capital cities. And it's not that no one has made this point before, I just don't think it's one that gets enough attention. Around a decade ago, the Reserve Bank looked at housing policy issues. It made a number of submissions to inquiries at the time. It was a time when housing affordability was coming to the forefront of our policy debate, and they did comment in one of their papers on this issue that a possible reconciliation of this pattern, that is the high house prices and concentration of wealth in capital cities, may be the unusual concentration of Australia's population in two large cities. Average housing prices tend to be higher in larger cities than smaller ones. Therefore, the expensive cities in Australia drag up the average level of dwelling prices more than in other countries. So, as I say, it's not something that goes unremarked, but it's something that's perhaps not remarked enough, that the concentration of our population in two major cities and a bit of a crescent in the southeastern part of Australia does limit our opportunities and makes it harder for younger families to get a start in life. And indeed, there's something called that I came across a few years ago called the Zipf law, and I'm probably not pronouncing that right. I've only ever read it, I haven't pronounced it before. George Zipf, his name was. He was a Harvard linguist, he came up with this rank versus frequency rule, which doesn't just apply to the development of cities, but also to linguistics and population settlement as well. It applies to commonality of use of words in different languages. But basically, in terms of cities, Zipf's law says that the size of a nation's second largest city tends to be about half the size of its largest city, and its third largest city tends to be about a third of the size of the largest, the fourth a quarter, and so on and so on. So, for example, in the United States, New York, when it's defined as a city, is 8.5 million, not as its larger contiguous area, but 8.5 million. It's around twice the size of Los Angeles at 3.9 million, about 3 times the size of Chicago, 4 times the size of Houston, and it was also approximately 5 times the size of Philadelphia. Now, there doesn't seem to be any quite reason or rationale for why that relationship holds, but it also holds for France, for Mexico, for Peru and a bunch of other countries, but it doesn't. Australia's one of the few countries, the United Kingdom's another, but Australia's one of the few countries where this law does not hold. Sydney has a population of 4.4 million and Melbourne just over 4 million, and our largest top 5 cities, rather than gradually decline according with that Zipf law, our cities fall away very rapidly, and only 17 Australian cities have a population of more than 100,000. Indeed, when you compare us to the United States, a country we're often compared to, although we are so much younger, in the top 5 cities in the United States, somewhere between 5 and 15% of the population, depending on how you define it. Whereas here in Australia, our top 5 cities are almost 60% of our population. A remarkable difference, and probably goes a long way to explain the high cost of housing in this country. So in terms of trying to develop new centres and new cities to take the pressure off our major capital cities, I think we should not go west but move north and go to Northern Australia, because our more recent successful cities as a nation have been developed in Northern Australia. Of those 17 cities that are above 100,000, 5 of the youngest of those cities, 5 of the more recently settled of those cities, 3 of them are in Northern Australia. Cairns, Townsville and Darwin all have populations over 100,000, and you've got a Mackay, Rockhampton just sitting below 100,000 as well. All of those cities were developed in more recent times. Indeed, most of them were actually developed in the decade of around the 1880s, just after the Burke and Wills expedition, and a bit of a period of development in Australia. And that period of development was somewhat funded by a mining boom that occurred in the 1860s that actually helped fund the Burke and Wills expedition directly, and then subsequently different people moved up north and developed new towns and cities. And we have just gone through a mining boom ourselves, albeit we're not left perhaps with the resources to develop as we should have been, but we should now be using the legacy of that boom to lock in and strengthen the development of Northern Australia, and particularly its towns and cities. So I applaud the government for bringing on a Northern Australian agenda, for putting forward or developing a Northern Australian white paper, and I hope that it delivers something that's going to attract young people away from our major cities to new frontiers and new opportunities in our nation. And we can't force people, and I don't want to force people to leave Sydney or Melbourne or Brisbane, but we should try and encourage them to do so by creating new jobs and opportunities, by building on our great strengths in agriculture in the north in particular, through the development of dams, through the development of better road networks for our beef sector. All of these things that create jobs will attract people, and that will attract more people, and that will both take the pressure off our capital city and spur development in new towns and cities. And what we need to do in this country quite clearly is engage in some form of arbitrage between our major capital cities and our regional towns and centres, because when you've got a situation where you're approaching $1 million for a house in Sydney and only $300,000 in a regional centre, surely the right policy solution is to encourage more people to sell a house for $1 million in Sydney and buy a house at $300,000 in a regional town or centre. That will be better for our economy, it will be more efficient distribution of our population, and it will save young people costs. Now, they're not going to move, though, if there are not the jobs and opportunities and development that would exist in those towns and centres, and that's what we need to spur and create. And I very much hope we do that in the development of our Northern Australian policy. And it's not just our agricultural sector. We have 3 very good universities in the north, James Cook University in Townsville, Central Queensland University in Rockhampton, or based in Rockhampton, they have campuses all over the place, and Charles Darwin University too as well. And all of those universities have a role to play in developing the north. The government has already announced that it will house a tropical medicine unit at James Cook University, and I also hope that education is a major focus of the Northern Australian White Paper, because there are enormous opportunities in our north. There's a great lot of research that occurs there in the Great Barrier Reef and other areas, and there certainly needs to be more done there. So I do think if we want to get cheaper houses in Australia, our solution must be regional development, and if we're serious about regional development, Northern Australia is the frontier for this country, and we should have a forensic focus on that, not just for the next term of government, not just for the next 5 years or 10 or 20, but a decades-long plan to develop the north of our country and spread our prosperity and population all over this great land.
Thank you.